Hello, everyone. My name is Abel Ndasho. I'm the Project and Communications Coordinator for the NH Academy. Welcome to today's webinar on open data. In this webinar, we're delighted to have Medha Devare, who's a Senior Research Fellow and Module Lead at CGIAR Big Data for Agricultural Platform at IFPRI. We will soon hear from her on how to make our data open and accessible, and she will give us an insight into the big data, open data world. I hope by now most of you know that the ANH Academy Week is taking place in Hyderabad, India from 24th to 28th of June. That's just in 4 weeks' time. Medha will also give a plenary masterclass on open data on the first day of the Academy Week. That's on Monday, June 24th. So hope to see you, many of you there. If not, we will be live streaming this and most of the presentations and panel discussions of the Academy Week online on our website. So please do follow us online at our website. If you can't, please join the conversation on Twitter also using the official hashtag for the conference, that's ANH 2019. Sunita will soon tell us a few words about today's webinar and do a bit of introduction. But before we get started, I'd like to go over a few technical issues so we all know how to participate in today's webinar. You will see the presentation on the left of your screen. On the right, you have the control panel that will allow you to ask questions. You have the opportunity to submit text questions to Medha by typing your question in the question or chat box in the control panel. You may send your question at any time during the presentation. We will collect this and address them during the Q&A time at the end of the presentation. All participants are currently muted. If you want to ask a question using the audio and you're sure your microphone speakers are functioning, use the raise your hand function during the Q&A session. That's the yellow hand on your control panel, and we will unmute you. If at any point you experience any technical issue, please check your audio setting and your internet connection. If lost, please try to connect to the webinar again using the same link. This webinar will be recorded and will be available afterwards. That's it from me for now. Over to you, Sunita.
Hi, my name is Sunita Karyala, and I'm an associate professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'm also the principal investigator of IMMANA. And thank you for joining this very important webinar series. And thank you for Medha for agreeing to do this. The idea of this webinar came about because as several of the IMMANA grantees and IMMANA researchers, and as you know, the ANH Academy researchers have posed the question, including the donors, on how should we as a research community be planning to make our data open access. Several of us, although our hearts are in the right place, and that includes me, we are not always very well equipped with the steps to do so in terms of how to plan for open access data, which is increasingly being demanded by all donors, including IMMANA donors and all the BMGF, USAID, so on and so forth. So we approached Medha, who is a very passionate is a passionate advocate of fair data and fair access to data, and also is an expert in helping the research community to make our own data open access. She's also an expert on how to access big data and how to using diverse set of platforms. So we're delighted to have Medha here, who has volunteered to help IMMANA through this journey and IMMANA researchers, but also as our initial conversations were about IMMANA, and then we realized that that we should open this up to other people working on the context of agriculture nutrition research. Several of us have the same set of donors, same set of requirements from our own institutes, and several of us genuinely feel that we should be learning and making our data open access. So with that, I welcome Medha and you all to this webinar. And as Abel already has said, Medha is a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and she leads the CGIAR platform for big data in agriculture. And Medha is an expert on bioinformatics, data knowledge management, and ontology development and semantic web technology. She has led this creation of this big data in agriculture initiative with the CGIAR, and has spearheaded the initiative to make various CGIAR data sets open access and discoverable through this platform. She'll tell us what this is all about and guide us through this. Also, as Abel said, she'll be giving a plenary masterclass on June 24th, which will be live streamed and recorded as well. And she has also kindly offered to meet people one-on-one in case anyone wants to take this forward and take her offer of making their own data open access, and she will be there at the ANH Academy to answer our questions. With that, Medha, on to you.
Great. I hope you can see me. I just wanted to pop myself on screen quickly, just so I can say hello, and then I'll turn myself off because I'm actually supposed to be sort of on vacation and doing this from elsewhere, not from my office. So I'm hoping the technology will kind of hold with us just for a little bit longer. But hello, everybody. Thank you for attending.
Hi.
Yeah, so I'm going to turn this off now. Right, so Sunita provided to what I do, and I'm not going to say much more than that. You can see my screen, I hope, so you know a little bit of who I am. What Sunita didn't mention was that I actually am a researcher myself. So my background is as an agronomist. I was leading a big project in Nepal for several years before I came to France to take on a position that allowed me to lead open access and fair data types of activities, and so I feel the pain from both ends, really, which is not the best place to be. But I can very easily put on my researcher hat and say, okay, you know, this is all fine, but why should I do it? You know, what's in it for me? So everything that I try to develop or propose or coordinate, really, what I'm doing more nowadays is just trying to push things in the right direction and put my budget in the right places. But all of that is guided by the what's in it for me from the researcher hat. To the extent possible. So I hope that some of this will resonate with you and that, you know, we can have an open discussion about this as we go forward. Now, right, so I just advanced my screen. I hope it changed and that you can see it. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a background as to where I'm coming from. So currently, as Sunita mentioned, I lead one of the 3 modules of the big data platform for agriculture at CGIAR. And I was one of the folks who was involved in developing the proposal for this as well. And again, I think that was pretty helpful to have the strong background in data and knowledge management, as well as the researcher angle on this. What we're trying to do with the big data platform is to enable, you know, to have a use case really out there to harness what big data can give us. Big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, I'm sort of lumping them together in the same basket. What we ultimately want to do is to enhance the impact of what we're all doing as researchers in this space, which is the international agricultural research space, or international agricultural research for development space. And it's possible to do. We have the technologies and the tools at hand. What's lacking really is the organized data. And so how we've conceived this platform for big data and agriculture is as 3 pillars: organize, convene, and inspire. As I said, I lead the organized part of this because data is really at the heart of anything that you want to be able to do with big data, with machine learning and artificial intelligence. And that data needs to be understandable, it needs to be well managed, and increasingly we're talking not about open data, but fair data. And fair stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So that's an acronym that I hope you will take away with you as you walk away from this webinar. The other two modules of the Big Data Platform are important, but I'm not going to be talking about them today. Mostly I'll focus on the organized part. But as you might imagine, convene is about building, is about convening. It's about building the right sets of partnerships, making sure that we're all playing to our comparative advantages. Because certainly at CGIAR and you as researchers as well are in the same boat. We're not the experts on the technologies. We need to build the right partnerships to leverage the capabilities, the technological capabilities that are out there. So that's what, roughly speaking, convene is about. Inspire is sort of a more of an approach to try and enable some blue sky thinking, to use the good products that are coming out of Organize and Convene, and put them to, put some use cases against them. So trying to use those analytics and ICTs to really find ways to deliver information, in our case to farmers, to policymakers, to in your case it may be to also to smallholders or to families, to rural families, in terms of nutritional outcomes and good practices, etc. So that's kind of the Big Data Platform at its kind of core: organize, convene, and inspire. I'm going to start out just by talking a little bit about why we talk about findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Why are we talking about fair data? Well, there's a number of different reasons. You'll get all of these slides, and I've added some notes at the bottom, so you'll see those when you have them. So don't worry about trying to follow every little minutiae on the slides. But basically, what you're trying to do is build efficiencies into the process of research. So avoid unnecessary data duplication, enabling what we're all after is turning data into knowledge, turning data into insight. And in order to do that, and in order to facilitate the your return on investment, both for us in terms of the time spent, as well as for donors, funders, in terms of their actual investment in dollars or pounds or whatever it is, we need to be able to find the data, to be able to reuse data, to be able to share data, and to not duplicate efforts where possible. We, of course, want to be able to increase our visibility and demonstrate relevance. We want to be able to provide facilitate scientific inquiry and data-driven innovation. So being able to do that and accelerate our impact, the impact of that our work could have, very much depends on being able to find the data, being able to reuse it. So I hope that as I go through, you'll see some of this. And of course, the last two bits here are very, very important. Sunita mentioned the funder requirements, and they're only increasing. The world is increasingly going in that direction. I know UK aid has a very stringent open data, open access sort of policy. Certainly Gates does, USAID does. Those are our three primary funders at CGIAR. But a lot of countries are going in this direction increasingly as well. So it's something to keep in mind as you do your work. So there's a reputational risk as well here of not complying. And then the people we work with. For us, this is very important, probably for you as well, as you work with organizations in whether they be in developing countries, whether they be NGOs or academic institutions in country. You want to be able to democratize access to knowledge, to the knowledge that's being generated in that country or in that region. And to build capacity there, of course. So those are some of the sort of broad brush strokes as to the why should I bother with this. And I hope that that's fairly convincing. Now, diving right into how we can leverage fair data. How do we enable findability and accessibility? I'll talk a little bit about how to actually make your data fair. But first, I want to sort of present a case for why we are talking about all of this. So I'm going to take the case of how we've gone about doing this, and what I want to show you is something called Guardian, which is the URL is there, guardian.bigdata.cgir.org. And when I enter, this is I didn't want to do a live demo here, but I've done some screenshots. So I can do a search for something like this, which is pretty relevant to you, nutrition and women, two search words in the Guardian search box. Right now, what this is doing is enabling the discovery of both data and publications all across our 15 CGIAR centers. But we're not only focusing on CGIAR centers, but increasingly other repositories that are out there, so that we can bring in, or not really bring in the data, but point to the data and the publications where they sit, and build some powerful tools around them. And you'll see that as I go through, I hope. So my search for nutrition in women returned in the CGIAR world across all of our repositories, our 30-odd repositories, 15 for publications, 15 for data sets. I get 933 publications and 58 data sets. As you look through this is just a screenshot of the first page of results. You see a number of different centers from which this data is coming: IFPRI and IITA, ILRI, SIP, etc. And you go down, you see a number of different centers. And what we're also doing is enabling as I said, pointing to resources in other places as well, including PubMed Central, which is a repository of publications. The ENA accessions, which is European Nucleotide Accession, Archive accessions. And in this case, there aren't any because of the search terms. If I'd put in something like maize or a commodity of some sort, or a human disease, perhaps, I would have gotten more accessions there. And then the gov.uk, this 3,600 a number refers to publications only, because that's what I find on the gov.uk repository, and some of those are IMMANA publications, in fact. So if I go through and just look at the gov.uk, just to give you a picture, this is what that looks like. So now when I click on that number, I get taken directly to gov.uk. What we're trying to do is actually make the resources that we find outside of CGIAR play in that same sort of world, so that it wouldn't, you can go out if you want to the particular repository, but we'd like to bring the resources to bear into the analytical and sort of other tools, the data aggregation tools that we're building out within the Guardian ecosystem. So I'll show you some of those tools as we go forward. Now, if I look at the CGIAR data sets, the 58 data sets, I see this list of data sets. I can look at one of them, and I chose the one that just so happened when I demonstrated this, I think a long time back, to Sunita and the IMMANA group in London. It was funny, but it so happened that this was an IMMANA data set. I think an IMMANA collaborator anyway. So they knew Jennifer Twyman. You might also. But this is a data set that is pointed to from Guardian. It sits at one of our centers, CIAT, the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, which is based in Colombia. This is the first part of that record. And what you see immediately is a license, terms of use in the left-hand side, and the DOI, which is the actual persistent link to that particular resource. And to get to the resource, I have to click on that link and I'll get there, because this is not, we don't actually hold the data sets. So Guardian is not holding the data sets, it's just pointing to them. And then you see the authors, who it's available from, etc. If I click on any one of these authors here, I would be able to see other resources that they have also authored that are available through Guardian. Now, if I go scroll further down in that same record, I see a little bit of a summary of that data set, and I see some keywords that allow me to, by clicking on them, it would be like doing a search in Guardian again, and so I would be basically able to refine or filter using these keywords. On the left-hand side, what you see is a little panel titled Fair Compliance, and that allows me to see, okay, how fair is this particular resource? or how fair is this particular center, or how fair is CGIAR as a whole. So I can see that at different levels. I'll talk a little bit more about the fairness and how those scores are computed, but each ring in that schematic stands for one of the F, A, I, and R, starting from the inside. So almost the most complete ring, the most inner ring is the F, then the A, then the I, and the last one is the R. And typically, people have the most trouble with the interoperability and the reusability, so the I and the R. So that's with reason. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. But before I leave this, so when I go further down, what I see is an ability to get to the dataset files directly without clicking on the DOI, only for those data sets that are completely unrestricted. So in this case, this was a CC0 license, I believe, which is the least restrictive. And so pretty soon you'll be able to click on these and go directly to those resources without, it basically is cutting out several clicks for you. What you also see at the bottom of this is the relevant publications field. Now, all of these publications don't underlie this data set, but what Guardian does is we have algorithms that enrich the metadata that comes from those data sets that are found. So there's a lot of text mining and data mining that goes on behind the scenes. That is used to enrich the metadata record that comes in through the repository. And then that enriched metadata allows us just to guess at, go through the other publications that are, or the other, not the other, but the publications set that is in Guardian, and say, okay, here are some publications that we think are related to this data set. So that's pretty cool, because usually people upload a data set file in one repository, they upload a publications file in another repository, and the two tend not to be linked. And so you can't even find the data set that underlay a particular publication, let alone find related publications to sort of flesh out the context around what it is that you're looking at. So this is kind of a neat thing that we've enabled through, again, it's a technological approach to something, to a gap, really, if I might say that, because those links aren't already hard-coded between publications and data and vice versa. So that's kind of what a record in Guardian looks like. Now, I've talked about findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. So the obvious question you might be asking yourselves is, this is all very fine, but how do I actually make my data fair? So what we've done is on Guardian, again, we have enabled you to figure this out. And I don't want to go blow by blow through this. For each of the four things, but what I will say is the key bits for findability, to attain a good score for the F, 4 and higher, ideally higher than 4 is what you're aiming for, is first of all, you must have a persistent ID for your resource. So that means it has to be either a handle or a DOI. Just plugging something with a URL and sticking it somewhere is not going to do it. So the persistent ID is a pretty critical thing, and that's what PID stands for, is persistent ID. You'll see this all in my notes when you get the slide deck. The other critical thing is that the metadata, there has to be some basic metadata. So there has to be a title, a URL for the resource itself, ideally, then the authors. You have to know who published this, who's responsible for this, and the publication date. That's an absolute minimum for this. And then by adding some keywords, you might be able to get to even more points, basically. So the more metadata you have, the more you progress along that score. So having rich metadata, having the persistent ID, and then the last bit is making sure that the metadata is available, is searchable, is in a repository that's searchable, basically in a searchable resource. That's pretty critical. So if you do all of those things, you can get 5 or pretty close to 5. Similarly, when you go to look at accessibility, there's a clear guide here as to how to make your resource more accessible. One of the key things is to provide a user license. But rather than just plunking in a license or terms of use, if you actually use the CC and equivalent licenses, and these tend to be machine readable licenses, then you can progress further along the way. If you make your resource completely open, that is, use the least restrictive license on that resource, then you can get even further along on that scale. And then if you provide the URLs of the physical files associated with that resource, then you get even further. So all of these pieces are very clearly laid out here. And what we've done is to actually create a guide, a PDF guide that you can download from Guardian, and I'll show you where that is in a minute. I just wanted to talk a little bit about interoperability, but before I do that, I want to, I'm assuming that most of you are not familiar with the concept of interoperability, or perhaps only sort of in general familiar with interoperability. So before I dive into this, I do want to say a little bit about that. So when we talk about interoperability, when tech people talk about interoperability, they usually mean syntactic, what's known as syntactic interoperability. That is, machines being able to communicate and exchange data. So for instance, being able to serve up web pages, or being able to, really, I mean, serving up web pages is the key thing that everyone can, I think, identify with, the key example here. So that's syntactic interoperability. What we're talking about being able to enable increasingly is semantic interoperability. So how is a machine going to realize that when I say plant, what I mean is a green plant, not an industrial plant, for instance? How will a machine understand the nuances, the reasoning, or the thinking behind the word, the meaning really behind the data? And we can do this by using a common vocabulary at minimum, or an ontology ideally at best. And I'm guessing that you don't know what an ontology is. A common vocabulary is basically, think of it as a sort of a glossary, which provides a meaning, provides a definition of a term. So if in my world, if I had the term tillage, for instance, I would have a clear definition of what that term meant, what tillage meant, and then I would have a URI that identifies a URI is a basically persistent. It's like a URL, but an identifier for that particular term. So it's a unique identifier for that term. It's an address, a web address that a machine can go to and understand that term tillage is the same as plowing or something else, and there are synonyms there basically, and that refers to it's the same word essentially, whether I say plowing or tillage in different data sets. So it's basically allowing me to be able to ascribe the same meaning to different pieces of information, essentially, in very rough terms. With an ontology, what an ontology is trying to do is to impose not only the meaning and the definition, but also a hierarchy, to place knowledge or a definition in a hierarchy. So when I look at this, now this is unfortunately an old slide, and it's very, it's not exactly valid right now. You'll see why. But if I'm looking at, say, the town of, or the village of Stratford upon Avon in the UK, I know that there's a hierarchy in that geopolitical sort of view. So Stratford upon Avon is part of Warwickshire, which is part of England, which is part of the United Kingdom, which until recently used to belong to Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I can describe all of this in what's called a geopolitical ontology, which is very useful, because when I'm looking at a district or something like that, or if I know that a village is part of a district, then I can infer from the ontology, I can reason, or the machine, more importantly, the machine can reason that, okay, this is this URI, which belongs to this ontology, therefore I know, I can map it, and I know that Stratford upon Avon is in the United Kingdom, without my explicitly having to state that. So that's huge power, and that can be done. Quite easily. we have at our ontology, for instance, that we use very, very regularly increasingly in many of our tools for collecting data, as well as for describing data. So that's very important because it allows this kind of reasoning to happen that, okay, I'm talking about grain in wheat, and the grain is part of a spike, which is part of a plant, which is part of a planting process. It allows us to make links across different parts of an experiment or different parts of multiple experiments. I'll show you a little bit of that as I go forward, I hope. This is just a dive into the crop ontology, but I'm not going to spend much time going through these, just to show you that in the crop ontology and in most ontologies, there's sort of a trait. There's the method by which that trait is measured or described, and then there's a scale, so a scale or unit for measuring that. So in one URI, you actually get all these three things, which is absolutely critical when you're trying to describe scientific information or any kind of information, really. Any entity. This is a very useful way of representing knowledge, in fact. So that's an ontology. So what you can do when you have data that's well described using ontologies, using controlled vocabularies, is interoperate. Really, that data set can interoperate with almost anything else. So for instance, this is the linked open data cloud from 2017, and in order to get to linked open data, you need to be using these ontologies and controlled terms. But what this allows you to do, and increasingly in the life sciences, this is being used very fundamentally. So that whole magenta part, all those little circles to the left of my diagram here, are all life sciences. And each of those circles represents a particular database, typically, or a particular domain, but it's usually a database. So for instance, the protein database, the nucleotide database, they're all sitting in here. And because they're described using these kinds of standards, they can be then linked very easily across different domains even. So for instance, in your world, in nutrition, if you had say you had a deficiency that was caused by the lack of a particular, say the lack of zinc in the diet, and there was a gene that was known to respond to, or to be responsible for that, really, you could probably find the nucleotide sequence and the gene in the gene database and the nucleotide sequence database of NCBI. And if you had a phenotypic response to that, say you had noted that, and it was well described, it was well annotated using ontologies and controlled vocabularies, then you could link all of that together and you'd have sort of the complete picture of that that particular what do you call it, deficiency, or that particular phenotype, and the molecular causes of it, which just provides a bigger picture into what it is that you're trying to address. So I'm trying to relate this to your domain without knowing that much about your domain, because I'm an agronomist, as I mentioned earlier, but I hope that makes sense. And I have an example as we go forward of it. But when you look back, I'm just going to back up here. When you look back at the interoperability, what you see here is the key piece of enabling interoperability is using controlled vocabularies, standard vocabularies, and ontologies. So you get more points if you use, certainly you get more points if you use certain vocabularies in a particular domain, but you get even more points if you use ontologies, because they allow you to do more. They allow the machines to do more, essentially. So you can leverage the power of machine learning and artificial intelligence, the reusability. So what we've done is to compute in terms of being able to enable findability, accessibility, and interoperability. reusability is sort of a conglomeration of all three of those, as you might sort of expect, because to be able to reuse something, you need it to be findable, you need it to be downloadable or accessible, you need it to be interoperable so that you can combine different data sets, aggregate different data sets, and you need it to have clear licenses, clear terms of use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really reusability is a combination of these three things that went before. And why is all of this important? Well, FAIR allows you to get away from saying things like, oh, I have a PDF of my data table and I've uploaded it to the repository, and therefore now I'm open. Well, yeah, by the strict definition, maybe you are open, but how useful is that data? It's not. It's not useful. So in order to talk about how, when we talk about data-driven innovation, when we talk about data-driven data-driven impact, scaling impact, we need to be able to reuse data. We need to be able to make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So that's where this shift in paradigm comes in. And having the indicators, having these clear indicators, and having something to hang your hat on and say, okay, I have to do this, and then I get a 0.5. I have to do this, and then I get a 0.25, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That helps because it really gives you a guide as to how to go about making your data fair. Right. So now we talked about interoperability. I just want to show you quickly a screenshot of a tool that allows you to leverage this well-described, semantically described data. This is right now very much in development. So what I'm showing you is a very early kind of prototype screenshot. But what this allows you to do is once you're building up that semantically enabled data pool, say it's in Guardian. Right now we're working with Guardian, so it's that data says sits in Guardian. I can query that data in a multiplicity of different ways, but being able to say, okay, I'm looking for data sets, all data sets in Guardian on maize that have anything to do with maize. And I want them to be in Ethiopia, Kenya, Malawi, and Mozambique. That's the region I'm interested in. And maybe I'm interested in conservation agriculture. Maybe I'm interested in maize intercropped with pigeon pea for protein, nutritional outcomes, etc. I do that. And then when I click the submit there, what I see is 3 data sets in Guardian, or maybe it's 20, that meet my criteria. And it actually dives into the plot level, because now what I've done by making my data completely interoperable, I have actually annotated my column headings in the data set. So I'm not talking at the repository level where I can enter ontology terms and control vocabulary terms at the repository level to describe a particular resource. That's the metadata for that resource. What I'm talking about is actually diving into the data set. So at the data level, making the data set itself interoperable by looking at the column headings and using ontology terms there where possible. Assuming that's done, this is what you can do with the data. So I find that there are, a total of about 535 plots in Guardian, cells, 535 data cells that meet my requirements. And I can look at that and download those particular plots, or I can say, actually, I'm not interested in a particular kind of fertilizer, so I can remove that because that's not available in all my plots. I just want the data sets to be aggregated that have a consistent start date and end date for these countries in Africa, for these particular fertilizers, CAN and urea. I want the tillage to be conservation agriculture and conventional agriculture, and I'm interested in 2 kinds of intercrops, pigeon pea and soybean. Well, it says you have now narrowed down to 391 plots because you started out with 535 total. You've taken out the 144 plots that related to DAP, so you've ended up with 391 plots. I can download those 391 plots, and now what I get is an aggregated data set for those plots. So this allows me to actually look at data, to slice and dice data in different ways very, very quickly because it's well described at the data column level. and it allows me to aggregate data very quickly. Normally, this kind of exercise can take, days to weeks to months, depending on the size of the data and the how well or how poorly it's described. So this is a very powerful thing to have. The tool here is not the issue, though. The issue is the being able to have the semantically enabled data itself. So I want you to keep that in mind if that's possible. Enabling reusability, just to show you really quickly, again, in Guardian, what we envision is something like this. Now, we're already doing this with 2005 data for all sorts of crops. There are something like 30-some crops in this tool that you can look at. But I could imagine doing this for all data sets, being able to do a query for nutrition, for instance, nutritional outcomes of some sort, and then being able to see that data visualized on a map. As long as the geo coordinates, as long as the data is georeferenced, you should be able to map it dynamically. That's where we're heading towards, but that's still going to take quite a bit of time, I think. I just want to show you the capability because I want to provide an argument for what's out there, what's possible. So here what I've done is looked at potato yields, irrigated yield and rain-fed yield, and you can see that on the map. I can take one of my pins and drop it on any country on the map, and it'll pop up a sort of a summary statistic, whatever that statistic is that I've chosen. In this case, it's telling me that the irrigated yield in this case is giving me a minimum, a maximum, and a mean. In your world, I would love to see use cases for what it is that you're working with, and perhaps we can enable something like this as a first pass in the next year or so. Or maybe it'll take longer, but it's worth thinking about because increasingly things are very visual, things are very real time. How do we allow people to do this? So you can do it by country, but you can also, and this is not, I apologize for the quality of this, I've zoomed in and it's quite pixelated. But I've zoomed in on an area of what looks to be very high rain-fed yield in the top corner. It looks like of Germany there, and I've drawn a polygon, so I can actually do some neat geospatial stuff if I want to look at particular areas of interest that are either super national or sub-regional rather, or intra-regional or within a country. Essentially, I can get in, I can draw a polygon, and I can get a summary statistic. I can look at that, I can examine that data more. Ideally, we also want to be able to provide the data itself that sits within that particular entity. That's a little harder to do because, of course, what are the edges, et cetera, but it is something that all of these things are technologically possible, and we're trying to figure out now how do we get the data to catch up with the technology, essentially. That's where we're stuck. Right, so this is my last slide. I just wanted to give you an overview of Guardian and the whole ecosystem that we're working towards. So let's start with the green boxes on the left here. Those are the actual databases, some of which I've mentioned. I've mentioned UK-AID at the bottom there, PubMed, the European Nucleotide Archive, of course the CGIAR centers, all 15 of them I've just thrown into one big box, but those are 30-odd repositories already that we're harvesting. So what Guardian, the discovery part of Guardian, what it's doing is enabling the discovery of the data sets and the publications that are sitting in these things. It's harvesting only the metadata. It's not harvesting the data sets. All of the data and the actual resource sits where it sits. So that's happening. What we can then do is enable that semantic query that I just showed you over some of that data. And what we've already begun producing is sort of interesting data products based on these kinds of queries. What we also want to be able to do is to build a pipeline out to decision support tools. And we've already done that with sort of crop production type simulation tool or modeling. So we're able to then find data in Guardian and pretty seamlessly with very few steps, plug it into a model, into a crop production model. In this case, it's DSAT for those of you who are in that world, with a few translators built in there. and then be able to get an answer from that, from that decision support tool already. We've already seen the data explore and map part of it, which is the arrow just below Guardian Discovery. I just showed that to you. What we're also building is an upload functionality to Guardian. So you'll be able to upload your publication or your data set, whatever the resource is, into Guardian through a very easy to use and clear workflow that includes the addition of metadata, the tagging of your data set with ontology terms, so diving into the data set and enabling the addition of ontology terms or controlled vocabulary terms, the ability to check to make sure that you're not about to upload a data set with farmer names or with extremely honed in location information that allows other people to identify who those people are. So basically the idea is to have a checker to remove personally identifiable information here. That's what that middle gear is sitting under semantic and other tools. That's what that gear is talking about. In addition to that, we also have a whole bunch of tools that are based on ontologies and controlled vocabularies that allow data collection. So these are semantically enabled agronomic and breeding data collection tools to give you data that's already collected in a standardized, harmonized way that conforms to these standards, that conforms to ontologies and controlled vocabularies. And all of those data sets will be increasingly dumped into repositories, we hope, and then we'll be able to sort of fulfill this more or less virtuous cycle of being able to have that semantically enabled data. So there's ways to generate the data, to collect the data already harmonized, and then there's ways to get legacy data sets and re-annotate them using some of these semantic tools that I've shown in these two gears. And then, of course, that data, all of that data in Guardian is always available to search engines like Google, for instance, and to those who want to use that data, depending on the licensing, to build out capabilities for our policymakers and farmers and other researchers, of course, through the search engines particularly, to be able to use that data, to do something useful with it. The external apps, we hope, will take the data that's now easily interpretable and usable and be able to recommend have recommendation services, for instance, for farmers, for instance, for maybe for your, for your clients, if you have apps or people you're working with, ICT providers that you're working with, who are in the business of making applications to leverage data into insight, then this is what that box is for. So this is the entire sort of ecosystem that we envision, all the way from being able to collect the data through to being able to make sense of that data, be able to use that data and make recommendations, and in the end get to the insight part of this. That's the Guardian ecosystem, and that's what FAIR data will enable. So I hope this is somewhat clear. I've tried to cover a lot, I know, in a very short amount of time, but I wanted to try and do it at a fairly high level so that you had the big picture of what's possible. So I'll stop there. And of course, you'll have the slides, as I said. And if you have any questions right now, please feel free. If you have questions as you go through this later on, feel free to get in touch with me. Sunita and Abel and the others also know, I'm sure, how to get in touch with me. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Medha, for this very interesting and fascinating presentation on open data and fair data. I'm sure participants will have a lot of questions going on in their mind during your presentation, and I'll pass now to attendees if they want to ask any question using the audio platform. So if there's anyone who wants to ask a question, you can raise your hands. That is the green hand on your control panel, and then I'll unmute you. I can see Arshi at the moment. You have raised your hands. And so if you're still online and want to ask a question, I'm just going to unmute you so you can ask your question. Okay, I'm not sure. Okay, I can see Erina again, so I will try to unmute you. You can ask your question now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great.
Yes, I can.
So, thank you for your very interesting presentation. We in our organization, I'm from Wageningen Economic Research, are also talking about the subject making our data fair. And it's quite challenging. And I've got one question, and it's related to the interoperable, the I from fair. Sorry, it's difficult to pronounce. And you were talking about using the right
Vocabularies.
Yes. And how
Yeah.
do you know to choose the right words?
Well, it's not so much the right vocabularies. I'm sorry if that's what got that's not what I meant. What I meant was to use a controlled vocabulary, basically. So, you know, there's the agravoc, which is a controlled vocabulary, but it's very much focused on agriculture. Depending on what your subject is, what your area is. If you're coming more from sort of the nutritional aspect of it rather than the field agronomy aspect of things, you may want to look at the medical subject headings as well. It's called MESH. So MESH is a controlled vocabulary for the sort of the medical angle of things, and I'm guessing that it'll have a lot more for the for the nutritional outcomes and work that you may be doing. Agravoc may be something that you want to check out as well. These are simple to use. There's a search box. You go in, you type your term, and ideally it will find something that's a synonym or that particular term itself. And it'll give you a URI. So then that URI is what you would use.
It's very interesting to hear. And I'm also more in the field of consumer behavior. Do you know if there are also some kind of tool on that on that topic?
Yeah. This is something I know very little about, but from what I know, that I would say there isn't. So one of the things that we're doing at CGIAR is trying to build a socioeconomic ontology, and I'm guessing that some of what you're looking for would be in that. So I would encourage you to get involved in that effort, perhaps, and that's led by actually a Dutchman whose name is Gideon Kruseman. I'm saying it in the German way, but it's Krusman, Kruseman. And if you send me an email, I'll send you his. I'll put you in touch with him. What I forgot to mention that. It was that under convene, under the second pillar, we have what we call communities of practice. And one of those communities of practice is an ontology community of practice led by Elisabeth Arnaud from in France, who's in France. And then Gideon, who's based in Mexico with one of our centers, leads the socioeconomic development community of practice. And there are a few others as well, but he's the one who you would want to get in touch with. And anybody is welcome to join those COPs. So if you feel that you'd like to join, you'd like to know more about these COPs, you can find them on the Big Data website, which I omitted to mention here. I should have added that. I will in the slides that are circulated. But it's basically, if you Google Big Data CGIAR, you'll find it, Big Data Platform CGIAR. But it's bigdata.cgir.org, I believe, the website. And you'll find the communities of practice. And more information in general on what we do, what we're trying to do there. I should also say that all of this stuff, if it sounded to you that, oh yeah, we have all the answers and we're doing it all great, it's far from it. We're very much still at the beginning stages as well. We're all struggling through the same sorts of issues. And I feel that the more we can work together, the more we can learn from each other, the more we help each other.
Okay, great. So the next question, the person who raised the hand is Alan. I'm not sure if you can, we've unmuted you, but if you get the code, now you'll be able to ask a question. So Alan, over to you. Okay, so hello,
it got
Alan.
very
Can you?
quiet.
Okay, so Alan, you'll be the next person to ask the question. So if you're still online, you can ask your question. Okay, I'm not sure if Alan is online. So I will see if we have more participants or attendees who are raising their hands to ask a question. Going through. Yeah. Arshi, if you're still online, I will unmute you. You can ask your question. I think you're self-muted, so you can. Hello, Arshi, can you hear us? Arshi Mohababa?
You know, Abel, perhaps people could also put their questions. Abel?
Yes. So
I'm
yeah.
wondering if people want to put their questions in. Can people put their questions in chat as well?
Yes, they can. So if the audio version is a bit difficult for technical reason, you can still submit your question in the question in chat drop box here, and I'll be able to read that question to you. So you can also use that feature. I'm trying to see if there are more questions coming through the question box. So both Alam and Arshi, can you hear us? Can you? Okay. Let's. I think. Yeah. Yeah. They're not online anymore. So we will pass this to them. So we've started the webinar a bit late. So I think we can still stay for another 5 to 10 minutes if we have more questions. Is that okay, Medha?
That's fine with me.
Okay.
This is Sunita. I have a question. Can people hear me?
Sure. Yep.
Yeah. So what do I need to do? Like you said, the first thing is to create a. Thank you. That's a really impressive presentation, and makes me realize how little I know about this. So given from this end, and I presume there are other people like me, is where do I start? What is the I have let's say I'm going to have a data set that I need to make available, sooner than later. What are the key steps that I need to take as I'm say going to collect data or yeah.
Well, so there are two separate questions there. So let's not tackle the collecting data right now. Let's just say you have the data.
Just making the data available. Like how do I plan? Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks.
So you have the data set. Typically, I mean, okay, I want to ask you the question. I'll just state. Most of the data sets that I look at, that I've seen, or many of them anyway, when I look at the data set, it tends to be one spreadsheet. It has typically just one tab, unlabeled tab, and it has rows and columns of data. The columns have certain headings, and they could be headings like HH, so HH, LOC, EXP, CP, AD, whatever. I look at that data set as somebody who's supposed to be in the field, and I can't understand what that data is saying. That data is not really something that's usable by me. So the first step is, of course, to make sure that you have some metadata, right? So typically what we advise is include a metadata tab. Or if you don't want to include a tab, include a README file with your data set, that the two things are completely linked and they go together wherever they go. That's harder to do, which is why we say put your tab in the data set itself so that you're clearly stating what is the title of this data set, where was it collected, when was it collected, by whom, for what project, what are the treatments? What are the, what am I looking at here, basically, right? What is this about? Because metadata should tell you the who, the why, the how, the when, the what, in broad terms. So that's an absolute must. That must be there. Ideally, your column headings would be understandable. Many people don't like to have long, long bits, especially for socioeconomic surveys, for instance. The column headings tend to be completely unmanageable. So there, people use code books, and that's fine as long as those code books are referring very clearly to certain to those columns, and I can have my program, my R script or whatever scripting I'm using, understand that this column D refers to crop production in whatever it is situation, or this is what has been reported by households for crop, what they produce during this season. So that's at the very base of it. That's what you can do as a researcher. That's what I can do as a researcher, is make sure that my data is very, very well described without including personally identifiable information. Where possible, include location information, because in our world, location is everything. But that, again, is a fine line to walk, because if you are in a very small village and you have coordinates, then I can, I or anybody else can, a less benign presence, can identify that particular household, and we don't want that. So increasingly, and with great sadness on my part, we're having to recommend that you blur up, basically. So there are some guidelines, there are some privacy and ethics guidelines as well that people can find on our website, Big Data website. So these are things to take into account and do a good job on as a researcher. Now the next question is, okay, now I've got my data into shape. I need to put it somewhere. And so that's very key, because many of the findability and accessibility, particularly score, depends on your making that thing available through a repository or a database that can be, where you can access that stuff. So you need to find somewhere to put it. Now, that's a big question, because small organizations or projects or entities in developing countries don't have the resources to manage a repository on their own, to set up and manage it. And there's no reason why you should have to do that. There are other places where you can put your data to make it visible. So what we're trying to do with Guardian is to enable that kind of democratization by setting up a repository for anybody and everybody. You can go into Guardian, you can say upload, and be taken through these steps that allow you, that cue you on how to annotate your data, how to annotate how to add metadata at the higher level, not just at the data set level, and then how to clean it of personally identifiable information and upload it. So these are all steps that you'll have to follow. And that FAIR guide that I started showing you, which is quite detailed, will help you in making your data more fair, so that you're with these tools, with all of these tools, you should be able to then get that data up somewhere and fulfill these recommendations, essentially, and the recommendations of your funders. Does that answer your question, Sunita?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Medha, for this. We've got one question from one of our attendees, so I'll read that to you. So the question is from Orly. It says, a very practical question. In which form do we need to submit our data as IMMANA grantees?
Okay, so that's not for me, because I don't know what form, if you're recommending a format, and what format that is. I'll tell you what we're doing just real quick. At CGIAR, most of the data that's submitted is Excel spreadsheets. That's not ideal, but it is what it is, and so we work with that. So just to throw that out.
So does it mean that IMMANA grantees, they can also submit their data to be included on the Big Data CGIAR website?
In Guardian, yes, that is how we're envisioning people will submit data, because whether we like it or not, Excel is the sort of the common tool and the most easily understood one in terms of data archiving, managing, manipulating data. So that's the way we go.
Oh, not Stata.
Well, Stata is more analytical. I mean, it's a statistical analysis tool, but we can so the Dataverse that's set up to handle this can handle Stata files as well. But ideally, I mean, most people seem to submit in you know, as Excel files, but Stata is fine as well.
Okay. In IMMANA, this is Sunita here. In IMMANA, we haven't pre-specified how to submit. So we don't have a recommended version. And this is why we brought Medha on the webinar to actually advise us on how best to make that happen. But with IMMANA grantees, we'll be taking these conversations forward as well.
Great, yeah.
Okay.
And as I said, you know, it'd be cool to use you guys as sort of a use case, an early use case for the upload functionality. So if there's interest in that, then we can try and work with you on making sure that whatever we build out is responsive to your needs.
Okay, the next questions that we have is from Julian. Julian asked, how often Guardian is updated?
Good question. We have weekly scrapes of metadata to update the metadata, and then I think it's a monthly sort of very, very deep, complete rebuilding of the indexer, of the entire metadata index. So at least weekly, we find is plenty good enough because our repositories aren't updated that frequently. They don't change that much from week to week, but we're trying to be careful, and so it's weekly really.
Okay, great. I'm sure, Julian, you've got the answer there. We can still wait for another 5 minutes, so I will again pass it to attendees. If you have any question, you have two options to submit your question. You can either raise your hands, and then I'll unmute you if you want to ask using the audio, or you can also type in your question using the question or chat control panel. So it looks like we don't have any question from attendees. It looks like they all seem to understand how the big data and open data works, which is a great thing.
Either that or they're completely floored by everything I've said, and they're sort of sitting there scratching their heads, for which I apologize. I hope I can be clear if that's the case when I do the plenary.
But at the same time, they can reach you using the email address that you've submitted.
Absolutely, and I'm always happy to
you have
talk.
A follow-up questions that you want to ask to Medhi, please reach her at the email address that you can see on your screen. I'll try to see if there is more participants changing their mind and they want to ask a question at the end. Yeah, that's all that we have in terms of the Q&A session from my end. I'll see if Sunita wants to add anything as a conclusion.
Yeah, thank you very much for everyone. Sorry, we had a glitch and we started 5 to 8 minutes late. Thanks for bearing with us. Thank you, Medha. That was very useful and very informative. And we look forward to your plenary masterclass, which will be slightly longer, so you have more time to engage with the audience and take questions and give us more advice on how to make data fair. And those of you, thank you everyone for attending. And any of you have any questions, please, Medha has kindly offered that she would answer your questions. Please copy her, but also would appreciate if you can copy Abel or me or both of us on it so that we know what's going on and we can perhaps coordinate something else in the future if there's a critical mass that is interested in taking this forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sunita.
Thanks for giving me this opportunity, Abel and Sunita.
Thank you.
And look forward to seeing you in Hyderabad.
Okay, great. Thanks, Medha, once again.
Sure.
Yeah, see you in Hyderabad, everyone, at the Academy Week.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.